In late 17th century, a new war was ready to start in Europe. The Swedish Empire became a dominant power by building a powerful state centered around the Baltic Sea. However, this powerful empire was surrounded by enemies from multiple sides. Denmark-Norway and Russia were among them, exploiting anti-Swedish policies. Eventually, Denmark-Norway, Saxony, Poland-Lithuania and Russia waged war against the Swedes in 1700 and began attacking the dominion of the new young ruler of Sweden, Charles XII. In this video, we are going to see how Sweden and Denmark fought on the onset of this conflict, and how Sweden managed to repel the Danish attack. Between 1560 and 1658, Sweden created a Baltic Empire centered on the Gulf of Finland and comprising the provinces of Karelia, Ingria, Estonia, and Livonia. During the 30 years where Sweden gained tracts in Germany as well, including Western Pomerania, Wismar, the Duchy of Bremen, and Verden. During the same period, Sweden conquered Danish and Norwegian provinces north of the Sound 1645 and 1658. However, the Swedish state ultimately proved unable to support and maintain its army in a prolonged war. Campaigns on the continent had been proposed on the basis that the army would be financially self-supporting through plunder and taxation of newly gained land, a concept shared by most major powers of the period. The cost of the warfare proved to be much higher than the occupied countries could fund, and Sweden's coffers and resources in manpower were eventually drained in the course of long conflicts. Charles XII of Sweden succeeded Charles XI of Sweden in 1697, aged 14. From his predecessor, he took over the Swedish Empire as an absolute monarch. Charles XI had tried to keep the empire out of wars and concentrated on inner reforms such as reduction and allotment, which had strengthened the monarch status and the empire's military abilities. Charles Frederick, son of Frederick IV, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp and a cousin of Charles XII, was an ally of Sweden, and he was married on May 12, 1698 to Princess Hedwig Sophia of Sweden, eldest sister of Charles. Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway, another cousin of Charles XII, succeeded Christian V in 1699 and continued his anti-Swedish policies. After the setbacks of 1700, he focused on transforming his state, an absolute monarchy, in a manner similar to Charles XI of Sweden. He did not achieve his main goal, to regain the former eastern Danish provinces lost to Sweden in the course of the 17th century. In 1700, the Danish infantry was composed by 27,600 line infantry, 1,200 naval infantry, 1,540 grenadiers, and 9,600 militia. Their heavy cavalry was made up by 402 life guards, 402 horse guards, 57 Drabant Guard, and 4,556 line cavalry, while they also had 7,500 for dragoons and 800 for militia dragoons. In total, their army was composed of 39,940 infantry and 13,723 cavalry. On the other hand, the Swedish infantry was made of 1,900 life guards, 33,456 musketeers, 19,580 for pikemen, 6,528 grenadiers, and 8,400 militia. Their cavalry was made of 1,500 mounted life guard, 100 horse drabants, 15,000 heavy cavalry, 1,800 noble cavalry, 10,000 dragoons, and 4,000 Baltic militia dragoons. In total, they had 69,868 infantry and 32,400 cavalry. Denmark, Norway, Sax, Poland, Lithuania and Russia had agreed on invading the Swedish Empire on 3 fronts, and accordingly, Danish forces moved into Holstein-Gottorp, allied and dynastically tied to Sweden, and laid siege to Tunning in March 1700. This siege was the first military action of the war. About 16,000 Swedish troops were gathered in Scania to launch against Denmark, and another 10,000 just by the Norwegian border. The Swedish fleet went out from Karlskrona to Öresund with their 38 ships of the line, the Danish fleet of 40 ships, however, blocked their pathway in the west entrance of Drogden, and forced the Swedish ships to sail another way across to the east by the name of Flintranen, which at the time was claimed to have been too shallow, but Charles XII gave order that they should try. At July 13th, the Swedish ships went over Flintranen with only 5 ships that ran aground and got stuck, which had to be pulled up. With the run across Flintranen completed, the Swedish ships met up with an English-Dutch combined fleet of 25 ships, commanded by George Rooke, with the Anglo-Dutch fleet laying just outside the island of Ven. The combined fleet pressured the Danish ships and forced them a retreat to Copenhagen, where they were utterly under fire and pinned down. Instead of sending troops to help the occupied Holstein, Charles decided to land on Humlebæk, which had been suggested by Carl Magnus Stuart and Hans Wachtmeister. With some minor stratagem, the Swedish fleet tricked the Danish forces on Zealand to believe a major landing would occur at Rungsted instead of Humlebæk. Out of 4,700 Swedish soldiers who sailed from Karlskrona, 2,500 would participate in the first wave against the Danish defenders at Humlebæk. The Swedish forces consisted of mostly infantry and were commanded by Charles XII Arvid Horn and Carl Gustav Renskield. The Danish forces on Zealand consisted of 5,000 men, of which 350 cavalry and 350 peasants were defending the entrenched beach. Commander of these were Jens Rostgaard, who also had 7 artillery pieces in his favour. There was a light fog and Swedish soldiers were put in small landing boats ready to storm the Danish entrenchment. Meanwhile, the Allied fleet bombarded Copenhagen to pin down the Danish troops and ships to not disturb the operation. At August 4, 1706 o'clock, Sweden launched the attack. A cannon strike was heard as a signal, and with supporting fire from nearby ships bombarding the Danish defences, the small landing boats closed into Humlebæk. First into the water was a lieutenant named Gustav Henrik Seagroth, who jumped in with his men to secure the left flank of the beach, constantly under fire from both Danish muskets and cannons and water reaching up to their waist. They kept moving, although slowly. The Danish cavalry saw its opportunity to strike and stop the advancing Swedes before reaching the beach and sent out a squadron of horsemen. The Swedes, however, succeeded in keeping their powder dry and with some accurate shots halted their charge. Then when reaching shallower water, they went in with their bayonets. This forced the Danish cavalry to retreat and the left flank was secured for a landing. The actions portrayed by Seagroth quickly encouraged the Swedish right flank under the lead of Charles XII, who didn't hesitate to jump into the water. With the muskets above their heads, the Swedish right reached the beach and forced the remaining Danish soldiers to rout, and the landing was secured. The Swedes built up field redoubts and camps the very next day for the 4,700 troops. Their state was, however, critical. Without having any cavalry on shore, they were like rats stuck in a corner for any possible Danish assault. After the successful landing on Humlebæk, the Danish defences started withdrawing to Copenhagen, which had been under fire from the Allied fleet. The fleet which had transported the Swedish soldiers was sent back to pick up reinforcements. After some days, they arrived with Magnus Stenbock, and the force at Humlebæk then reached 10,000 soldiers. The strategical plan was to lay siege to Copenhagen and force Denmark to surrender. A storm of the city was out of the question, since the morale of the Danish forces seemed rather high. Instead, it would get bombarded both from sea and land. However, on August 12, 1700, during his march to siege Copenhagen, Charles was told that Denmark and Holstein had made peace. He ordered the march to continue until the peace treaty was clearly confirmed, which it did get on the 23rd, when Frederick IV, Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, messaged the Swedish king that the peace really was established according to the terms of the Peace of Travendal, and that Denmark would not support the alliance against Sweden in the future. In Travendal, Denmark-Norway left the Great Northern War by obliging herself to not engage in future armed conflicts with Sweden. In paragraph 13th, the King of Denmark and Norway, in his own name and the name of his successors, promises to neither engage in hostilities with Sweden, nor ally with or in any way aid Sweden's enemies, and adhere to all earlier Dano-Swedish treaties. The Duke of Holstein-Gottorp's sovereignty was restored, and the treaty detailed the conditions under which armies and fortresses were to be maintained in the area. It was further agreed that Holstein-Gottorp be financially compensated by Denmark-Norway for the war costs, resulting in the subsequent payment of 260,000 Reichsdalers. As soon as Denmark-Norway was out of the war, Charles XII speedily embarked his armies and headed from Denmark to his Baltic dominions. Russian forces entered Ingria and laid siege to Narva in October, while August the Strong was preparing winter quarters in Livonia. On 30 November, Charles XII's army relieved Narva before turning south, sweeping August the Strong's forces out of Livonia, pursuing and decisively defeating them at Klisho and Fraustadt during the following years, forcing August to drop out of the war and the Treaty of Altrandstadt in 1706. Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway used the peace period to reform the Danish army. Instead of relying on mercenaries, the army was now raised from peasants distributed by Danish landowners. After the Russian victory at the Battle of Poltava, Denmark-Norway redeclared war on Sweden, abandoning the Treaty of Travendal.